Well, we're back following the fraud closure paper trail, and it gets uglier the deeper that you dig. FDIC Chief Sheila Bair now says millions of foreclosures could be, and to use her word, infected with faulty paperwork. And federal efforts to help struggling homeowners are falling short because guess what? The banks are refusing to reduce payments and playing paper games. All this, as we learn, those on the inside who have voiced concerns may have been silenced by their superiors. NBC senior investigative correspondent Lisa Myers introduces us to two industry whistleblowers in the third of her exclusive reports. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Dylan. Both the banks which service mortgages and the federal government insist they're doing everything possible to help troubled homeowners avoid foreclosure. But our NBC News investigation has found that that's sometimes not been the case. Two insiders who saw the process firsthand say the deck often is stacked against homeowners who deserve help. For almost 10 years, Chris Wyatt worked as a vice president for a large mortgage servicing company. A year ago, he quit the business. He says he couldn't stomach what he saw, a widespread unwillingness to help troubled homeowners by permanently modifying their loans. And worse, a deliberate strategy of pushing families into foreclosure. Has there been a rush to foreclose in your view?
I think there has been a rush to foreclose. I think the thing that most made me upset is that you had people that qualified for loan modifications that were denied and went into foreclosure.
Lost their homes.
Lost their homes.
Even though they deserved modifications.
Even though they would have qualified and deserved a modification.
Why would a bank or servicer do that?
It comes down to dollars and cents.
Wyatt says the bottom line is that when you count all the fees and expenses, servicers make more money by foreclosing than by modifying a loan, even with incentives the government pays for modifications.
They have a huge financial incentive to foreclose.
Wyatt, who's now a paid expert witness against banks, says servicers also were overwhelmed by the sheer number of people asking for help and denied some modifications just to clear up the backlog. Is there ever any consideration of the human carnage?
In the servicing industry? No, I don't think so.
Caroline Herron saw it all from a different angle. She helped design and implement the government's loan modification program as a consultant at Fannie Mae, the agency helping the Treasury Department run the program. She says there was pressure to get homeowners into trial modifications. Why was there such a rush to get people into these trial modifications?
Because the program was supposed to help up to 4 million people, and they needed to make progress.
So it was about the numbers?
It was about the numbers.
She says she warned Fannie Mae executives the program was hurting some homeowners, and they ignored her.
Fannie Mae executives were worried about getting the trial modification numbers up, and so we could deal with problems later.
Last year, Fannie Mae fired Herron. She says it's because of the concerns she raised. She's suing the agency. Fannie Mae says an investigation found no merit to her allegations.
You know, over time, I've just begun to think that this really wasn't as much about homeowners as it was originally portrayed, and it feels like it was more about the banks.
Even though publicly they said it was all about helping homeowners.
Correct. It seemed to be appease the banks, appease the investors, and we'll worry about the homeowners last.
Fannie Mae would not comment further on Herron's allegations. Treasury officials acknowledge that the performance of servicers has been inadequate, but they say they don't have the power to police them. In a settlement with bank regulators, servicers recently agreed to review foreclosures over the last 2 years and improve their treatment of customers. But critics say that is entirely inadequate, Dylan, and are pressing for tougher sanctions and big fines.
One of the whistleblowers is actually in that spot, Chris Wyatt. Received an email of some kind. What exactly is going on with him?
Well, yes, he received an email from a lawyer at Goldman Sachs. Goldman owns the company which Wyatt used to work for, Litton Loan Servicing. Even though in our report we never mentioned Litton, the email claims that Wyatt, in his interview with us, improperly revealed company secrets. The email states, Without mentioning Litton by name, your comments disclose confidential information learned while you were employed by Litton, and therefore are a violation of your confidentiality obligations. We reserve all our legal rights with regard to this violation. Now, the way I read this email, Dylan, it seems to suggest that the practices Wyatt told us were going on within the industry may, in fact, have been going on inside the company owned by Goldman Sachs. We contacted Goldman, which declined comment.
Interestingly, Goldman took a hit recently in the credit markets on speculation they may be vulnerable to a broad set of investigations, and we'll keep tracking that lead.
Last month alone, more than 70,000 families lost their homes. Foreclosures jumped a staggering 158% year over year. So can the little guy fight back? Well, Greg Hunter thinks so.
I think they can. In foreclosure, the bank has to show it owns your house. But what most people don't know is almost half the time, the banks don't have that paperwork to prove it in court. In many cases, it ends up lost or destroyed. It's a national problem that the banks would love to keep quiet, because knowing that could be your best defense in fighting foreclosure.
Everything was all right until I refinanced.
Like many homeowners, Jackie O'Brien is behind on her mortgage. She bought her house near Clearwater, Florida in 2004, but in 2007 fell behind on her payments following a death in the family.
I'd returned to England, and I was sort of giving support to family members and things like this. And when I came back to America, I was in default with my mortgage. I was behind with my payments.
She says she tried on several occasions to catch up on her payments with her bank, Wachovia. She showed us a photocopy of one catch-up payment for $8,500, but the bank wouldn't accept it and is foreclosing on her property.
They wouldn't take your payments after that?
No, they wouldn't take my payments. That was it. No more. They didn't even want to talk to me.
But in foreclosure, she discovered the bank filed a motion for lost instruments. In other words, the bank lost or destroyed the actual proof that it owns her house.
I think the note has been sold on so many times, and they've become very sloppy with their paperwork. It could be on a dumpster somewhere, for all I know.
A bank losing a mortgage note may sound like a rare occurrence, but a recent study by law professor Catherine Porter found it happens nearly half the time.
What I found is that banks failed to attach a copy of the promissory note, that is the evidence that the consumer owes the debt, in 40% of the situations. So 4 out of 10 consumers were being asked by their bank to make payments on a mortgage, but the bank didn't provide the evidence to establish what those debts were.
And last November, a federal court ruled against Deutsche Bank and stopped them from foreclosing on 14 houses until they could produce the note. Those foreclosures are still in limbo.
If your case ends up in court, don't let the mortgage companies off easy. Make them produce the note.
Chris Hoyer is a Tampa attorney who's on the internet with a free website that teaches people how to fight foreclosure. He thinks people should fight, not for a free house, but for a better deal.
If you're about to lose your home, at least make them produce the note. Make them prove, first, that they have the note, the IOU, and second, that the person who's standing in court is a person authorized by the owner to take your home.
And that's just what Jackie O'Brien is planning to do.
I'd like to know who actually owns my mortgage. I'd like to know who I can deal with. I'm going to make them produce the note.
She says the bank is pressing on with foreclosure and won't agree on a catch-up payment. In addition, she says they keep tacking on fees.
The only way that they will do it is that if I pay them something like $20,000 in fees and things, they want me to pay all these extra fees that they've thrown in on top.
Catherine Porter says excessive and unnecessary fees are also a national trend.
The most disturbing thing we saw was that most banks simply don't tell consumers what these fees are for. So we saw thousands of dollars of charges that were labeled as other or miscellaneous. And so consumers have no way to know if, in fact, those fees are legitimate.
We contacted Wachovia to ask about the case, and they said, due to customer privacy concerns, we cannot give specifics into pending customer actions, but we will work with customers through the delinquency and foreclosure process to keep them in their homes. O'Brien says if the bank can't find her note, they should renegotiate a new mortgage without the fees and payments she can afford.
I want to pay, I'm not looking for a free ride or anything. I want to pay my mortgage. I want to get my life back on track.
O'Brien goes to court Monday to find out how long she'll stay in her house. Attorney Chris Hoyer says if you do get a foreclosure notice, you should get an attorney, or at the very least, find out when and where your foreclosure court date is and show up. Do not just abandon your property and move out. For more on this, you can log on to cnnmoney.com.
All right, riddle me this. Why doesn't the judge just start out when something like this happens and says, can somebody provide me with the proof of ownership of the house?
You know what? I think that's a great idea, Allie. A lot of times people just move out. They say, oh, wait, honey, we got a foreclosure notice. Let's go get a U-Haul and move out. And so when the banks go to court, they say, hey, listen, the property's abandoned, Your Honor, so we want to retitle the note in our name. We want to reestablish the note in our name. And they say, well, there's nobody there to contest it. But if you contest it, that's when the problem starts. But yes, the bank should first off start out and say, hey, listen, where's the paperwork? Where's your mortgage? Where's the proof you own the house?
Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, a couple of country bumpkin names for slick operations with a foolproof business plan.
The profits to go to the private sector, but the risks to fall back on the taxpayer.
It worked beautifully for decades, Fannie and Freddie fulfilling the American dream. You buy a house by taking out a loan from a bank. The bank sells that loan to Fannie or Freddie. They, in turn, repackage all those mortgages and sell them to investors. They also guarantee the mortgages will be repaid. As homeownership grew universal, Fannie and Freddie prospered. Their CEOs, Daniel Mudd and Roger Siren, together earned $30 million just last year. But as they grew fat, critics say they got greedy, underwriting too many risky home loans that never should have been made. The collapse of the mortgage market and the housing market with it put Fannie and Freddie on the brink of going belly up, a potential disaster.
If they did, the mortgage market would break down and it would be 1929. We would go from a recession into a depression.
Enter the government, meaning you, the taxpayer, with the bailout. The government puts the two companies into conservatorship, replacing Mr. Mudd and Mr. Siren, and standing behind all of Fannie and Freddie's loans and debts. How much might that cost?
The difference between their assets and their liabilities, given the crisis they're facing, maybe of the order of $200 to $300 billion.
But any estimate of the cost is just a guess. If the crisis deepens, the taxpayer tab goes up, and many experts expect exactly that.
Home prices will continue to fall regardless of this government action. Losses will continue to mount regardless of this government action. It's only the taxpayers are going to cover the losses now. And then thirdly, we're getting very bad reads on employment.
When the government takes over Fannie and Freddie, their common stock, already battered, will become worthless. Preferred shares, however, are likely to be protected, not least because U.S. banks own some $30 billion worth of those shares. Russ?
Tony Gatto, thanks.
Whenever Fannie and Freddie found themselves in trouble, they would invariably point the finger to a government mandate that dates back to the Depression. The need to provide affordable housing to every American. To help make that happen, the government granted them privileged status, including guaranteed lines of credit, exemption from state and local taxes, and limited oversight.
You'd have people in Congress that would make it very clear that they wanted nothing to touch Fannie and Freddie.
Former Congressman Jim Leach says he tried to hold Fannie and Freddie's financial feet to the fire with little or no success.
At one point in time, they had more lobbyists in their employee than I think any institution ever.
In fact, CBS News has learned Fannie and Freddie now boast nearly 150 lobbyists, spending almost $175 million combined over the last decade alone, more than pharmaceutical giant Pfizer and defense contractor Boeing. The mortgage giants doled out $2 million more over the last 4 years to political action committees, money used as a weapon to fend off regulation that would have required them to maintain deeper financial reserves, to act as a cushion to the kind of risky loans that led to their undoing.
Fannie and Freddie were thuggish. The people who worked there misled other people. They used political power in an ugly way.
A few years ago, Fannie was fined nearly $400 million after an investigation revealed it overstated earnings by $10 billion to maximize executive pay. That cost former CEO Franklin Raines his job, but not 65 of the $90 million he received in bonuses and compensation. Now the CEOs who presided over the demise of Fannie and Freddie are out the door as well, walking away with some $30 million, while every American, it seems, is paying the price. Armin Katayan, CBS News, New York.
Charging 6 former top executives at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac with civil fraud, saying they misled the government and taxpayers about subprime mortgages.
Investors were robbed of the opportunity to make informed investment choices about whether or not to invest in the companies.
Those charged include former Fannie CEO Daniel Mudd and Freddie CEO Richard Siren. According to the lawsuit, Fannie told investors in 2007 it had $4.8 billion in subprime loans on its books. The SEC says Fannie actually held about $43 billion in subprime loans. Freddie's 2006 disclosure claimed between $2 and $6 billion of subprime mortgages. The SEC says its holdings were actually closer to $141 billion.
The government, the SEC, is suing both on fraud grounds and negligence grounds. I think they have a pretty simple case in terms of this being a negligent misstatement. All they have to show is that it was material. In terms of whether it was a fraudulent misstatement, which is necessary for Rule 10b-5, that's harder to prove.
The charges come as the federal government faces criticism for not bringing charges against executives who may have contributed to the financial meltdown. Fannie and Freddie both entered into agreements with the government, accepting responsibility for their conduct without admitting or denying the charges.
What's distinctive here is the government, the SEC, has settled with these two corporations, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, under a non-prosecution agreement which requires them to cooperate. So they should have the full cooperation of the two entities, giving them access to all the emails and all the documents.
Warren Levinson, Associated Press.
To the mortgage market we go, and freedoms and property rights in this country. This is a story that the housing finance and bank guys would rather you didn't know about. It's a plan not only to cover up the fraud closure, but to convince Congress to make it legal. Take a look.
It used to be that if you bought a house, your mortgage would stay at a single bank while you paid it off. But now, it's rarely that simple. Instead, imagine millions of different mortgages from all across the country stuck into a blender. Through a process known as securitization, the mortgages are mixed into milkshakes that are then sold to the government housing agencies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, as well as your retirement funds, your pension. The blender, if you will, is run by a private company called MERS. MERS Electronic Registry tracks what goes in each milkshake and acts as the actual owner of all these mortgages, enabling mortgage swapping without any of that pesky paperwork. In the process, too often, the question of who owns what frequently gets lost, and too often no one is held accountable for ensuring your home has your name tied to your note, a direct breach of the basic principles of independent property rights upon which this country was founded. And now, amid mounting questions about the process and the billions of dollars in lawsuits, the industry is pouring money and lobbying hours into protecting its interests at the expense of ours. Right now, lobbyists on Capitol Hill pushing for legislation that would not only legalize this blender process, but affirm MERS as the standard for tracking mortgages. If that were to happen, the industry could get rid of all the fraud closure lawsuits with Congress's implicit approval, Americans left with weakened property rights, banks affirmed as America's largest real estate holding companies, and homeowners out of a house and out of options.
It may be complicated, but I cannot think of anything more important to freedom and independence and an opportunity to move forward in this country than the protection of everybody's property rights, and this the ultimate betrayal of those very rights in this country. It is up to us and our lawmakers to stop it, in my view, before it is too late. Joining us now, Democratic Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur of Ohio, a MERS skeptic who plans to introduce legislation prohibiting the government, through Fannie and Freddie, from buying mortgages made in that MERS mortgage blender, where they may not be able to know who owns what. Congresswoman, why do you think this has even made it this far? How could a piece of legislation that is so corrupting to the basic foundation of property rights in this country even be entertained?
Because Congress has failed the American people in this mortgage foreclosure situation. And the very large mega banks and all of their emissaries, including MERS, basically marched to the tune of about 6 big banks in the country. And so whether they're servicers, whether they're MERS, it's all connected to the head, the very large institutions largely based in New York and Charlotte, North Carolina. And they've taken America for a ride because back in the early 90s, they, when the thrifts collapsed, which were the institutions that financed housing, the commercial banks wanted to do housing. But I said to myself, why? Because the payout is 30 years, whereas normal commercial loans they were used to making is 7 years. Well, they figured out they couldn't make as much money with housing, so they decided to hyperinflate it, and to make more money. And for a while, they made a whole lot, but they brought our country down, and several countries around the world, as you know, are having trouble as well. But these large institutions have enormous power inside of Washington at the U.S. Treasury, on presidential staffs right next to the president, like the chief of staff, the heads of our Treasury, regardless of administration. They have their fangs right into the Beltway, and they don't let up that chokehold. And that's what's going on.
Steve, so are you in danger to being foreclosed on? Guess what? There's a loophole that all homeowners must know about that can keep the banks from taking your house. Fox News legal analyst Bob Massey is here with me to explain. Good morning to you, Bob.
Good morning, Gretchen.
All right, so this is so complicated, but I want to try and break it down because it's so important. And you say it all deals with the MERS, M-E-R-S, the curse of the MERS.
Yes.
What the heck is that?
All right, so our viewers understand, this is complicated. MERS was put into effect about 10 years ago, actually by the lenders and Freddie and Fannie. And what it was, there's so many mortgages, millions that were chopped up. There was this electronic registration system that was used to actually register your mortgage. So when you went to buy a home, depending upon who your lender was, and depending upon what they did with the mortgage, this was a system electronically to record your mortgage, because that's how complicated it was. So it is a system of registration that was in effect over 10 years ago.
Okay, so now how can that come into play for some 62 million homeowners who may face foreclosure?
This is catching a lot of ground in the courts. So any of our viewers who has received a foreclosure notice from MERS, M-E-R-S, what the courts are saying is this. They're saying, wait a second. You are nothing more but a portal or a way to record your documents for the lenders. And that you literally, in the courts, Gretchen, we have a thing called standing. Somebody has to have a legal basis to foreclose. Some of the courts in this country, in California, Nebraska, Nevada, Florida, have said, wait a second, until you could show that you actually are a legitimate interest holder in that property, that you cannot foreclose. You don't have the right to do it because you don't hold the original note in your hand. Therefore, you're nothing more than a fiction that was created by the lenders, and the courts are basically restraining the foreclosures based on the MERS theory. So any of our viewers out there who have received this, I've been involved in a lot of this litigation. They need to look and have it studied by a lawyer for purpose of seeing if they can stop the foreclosure.